Today on Living History, we're speaking with David Moser.
Back then, they had no Chinese word processors. So all books were written by hand. Stacks of these were handed to me, all handwritten Chinese. And I had trouble enough reading printed Chinese. At that point, I was terrified. I was thinking, I'll just have to go home. I mean, there's no way I can do this.
David is a professor, a teacher, a jazz pianist, and he's the author of A Billion Voices, China's Search for a Common Language. Originally from Kansas, he came to Beijing in 1987 to help translate a book by his friend Douglas Hofstadter. He has spent 37 years in China, during which he has performed crosstalk on TV with Hou Yaohua and Da Shan, saw the changes to the Dunway system, and made many more memories that we hope to hear about today. David Moser, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Tell me, how did you become interested in China?
Yeah, well, I really took a turn in my career in the 80s. Up to that point, I'd been a musician since high school. That's all I wanted to be. And I went to music school, got a bachelor's degree in composition and trumpet. Trumpet was my instrument. And then was working at Indiana University on a master's. And for some reason that is not clear to me and probably will never be clear to me, I just became fascinated with languages in general and began to learn French and a little German, which I've forgotten completely. But when I touched upon Chinese, something happened to me, which just became an obsession. So I began to first of all begin with the characters because they were fascinating. And then once I started learning how to write characters, learning a little bit about them, then I thought, well, why not actually learn to speak Chinese? So anyway, I went into Chinese restaurants and struck up conversations. I sometimes invited some of the people, some of whom were students studying abroad and making money on the side, and I would say, come to my house and we can make dinner and we'll talk. And I had my tape recorder. And so for some reason, I was this had no point to it. I was going to be doing music the rest of my life in Boston, but suddenly I got obsessed with this. And by sheer chance, at Indiana University, I had met a scholar there, a professor there named Douglas Hofstadter, who wrote a book called Gödel, Escher, Bach, An Eternal Golden Braid. And it was a very unusual book, won a Pulitzer Prize. It was probably the first well-known book anyway that discussed artificial intelligence and its implications for translation and mind and psychology and so forth. But it was a very complicated book that had lots of wordplay and lots of language play and puns. And the book was just like a compendium of all sorts of intellectual ideas of that time. And so he knew that I was learning Chinese because he himself had been learning Chinese. He's a polymath, polyglot. He speaks 5 or 6 languages, and he was tackling Chinese. And he taught me a little bit. And so he knew that I was a Chinese fan, a Chinese obsessive about language. He found out from one of his colleagues that they were translating his book at Peking University into Chinese. And he's very picky about the translations. He wants them to be not, literally translated so that it feels awkward, and the English can be felt through the text. He wants it to be translated so it feels natural for a native speaker. So he said, you should go to China and take part in the translation team and help them translate the book, because they for sure are not understanding it all. And I want to make sure that this is a high-class translation. I'd only been studying Chinese about myself for about 3 years, and could speak somewhat, could read somewhat, but I mean, anyone who has tried Chinese knows 3 years is not enough time to learn fluent Chinese. It takes 10 at least, back then anyway. So he didn't have to ask me twice. I said, okay, great. So he bought the plane ticket, went there, we made the contacts. So in 1980, I think it was 1986 actually, I was at Peking University, a visiting scholar in the computer science department, someone who knew nothing about computers. And I was suddenly there working on this translation with a team of translators at Peking University. The translators were well aware that this was a difficult book to translate, because there were sections on molecular biology, sections on logic, section on mathematics, sections on music, a lot about Bach and fugues and things. So they realized there was no one person could translate this. So they actually had 5 or 6 people translating different sections. But as the manuscripts piled up, they began to see this was not going to work because the styles were all different, and it was hard to make the technical terms cohere across chapters because everyone was making up their own words. So they were actually happy to have me there because it was kind of in a crisis. But yes, I was there, and this was 1986 or 1987. Back then, they had no Chinese word processors. So all books were written by hand, and this book was no exception. So it was this paper with the squares there, it's the Gödel, they put this thing, they write the characters inside the squares. Stacks of these were handed to me, all handwritten Chinese. And I had trouble enough reading printed Chinese. So here I was faced with all these squiggles, and at that point I was terrified. I was thinking, I'll just have to go home. I mean, there's no way I can do this. But I had a skeleton key to the chicken scratches, which is the English original. So I would say, okay, here's the word computer. The word computer must be in this translation somewhere in this sentence. And I would look and then, Jishuanji, yes, here, this is it. So I'd be, you can write it that way, simplified. One by one, I began to see, and plus there were 5 different manuscripts by 5 different people. So there were different styles of handwriting, some just absolutely impenetrable and others more easily. So I spent the next really 5 years of my life, mostly off and on, looking at these pages and translating them.
Was it very difficult for you that different translators worked on different chapters?
In terms of written translation, there's really not much difference because the written language is not a matter of accent or local slang. This is standard Mandarin that was pretty well stabilized even back before 1949. But of course, the translators all had different accents. Some of them from the South, so that was another challenge that I had to meet, which is how do you hear? I can't understand some of what these people are saying, right? Luckily, the 2 people I ended up working with, one was Yan Yong in the computer science department, and a real genius, a really great mind. And I think a wise decision, another translator from the literature department, the language department, his name was Liu Haoming, was just a literary scholar, no competence in computers at all. So those 2 were a good fit because one was very good at the technical language and very good at doing, very accurate translations of that and science in general. But there were so many dialogues and references to great literature and even a whole chapter talking about translation itself. So we had this other person whose language was very good and his writing was quite elegant and concise. And so he was the stylistic editor, and he was also the one who was translating the sort of humanities aspect, and then the other guy was translating, Yan Yong was translating the technical aspects. So we were a great team, and we spent lots of time in their dorm room. When I see photos of Peking University dorm rooms, I can just smell them, feel them, I know what they felt like. These stacked bunk beds and, everyone sort of living, 6 people in a room sometimes. I think they were graduate students, so they only had 4 in a room. But no, I mean, that was such an amazing time, and really no space. It's kind of cluttered like this place is. There was no, flat spaces where you could lay things down on, and teacups everywhere. So, but it was an amazing time and very exhausting for me. Very exhausting because I was dealing in Chinese language at a very high level for the first time. I had lots of difficulty understanding just what they had written. But it was great because it was like a crash course or a cram school or like a military academy. I was every day drilling, by reading these impenetrable texts that were hard enough even in English. But here I am, trying to figure them out. But to my surprise, if you go slowly, and because I had the English, I was reading at a very high level of comprehension. I wasn't reading cold. I actually knew what this must say. So it was actually very easy for me to spot mistakes. Because, especially when I would see a very colorful idiom, and I would say, I wonder how they translated it. And I would very often find that they didn't, or they would literally translate it, it made no sense. So I was actually pretty good for this job because I had the time, I had nothing else to do, and I was was dedicated to it and was passionate about the language and learning about it. So it was fun for me, even though it was exhausting. I think my glasses had to be recalibrated about 15 times, because they kept getting more and more nearsighted as time went on. But it was great, and the translation was an exciting thing. It was a big part of my life, and the book was very famous already in China because there was a series of sort of introductory of little books that would give a brief introduction to major work in Western countries, scientific or literary. It was called 走向未来 or something like that, Toward the Future, I think it was. And they had a summary or a little description of the book. And even that brief description in the book sort of ignited a lot of curiosity among scholars, and especially people who were already thinking about computers and what they might mean for Chinese society. So it was quite a big seller, and so people already knew of the book, in fact. So that was exciting. There was a lot of excitement about it. People were willing to take part in it. But on top of that, which is exciting enough, there was China in the 1980s, and we all know what an exciting time that was. So I went there, of course, planning to work on this project, but it never occurred to me that I might stay there, because of course I would graduate and get a good job with my PhD or something, right? But being in China at that time, and I think for anyone who was there was such a sense of hopefulness and expectations, because everyone was very clear that China had opened up for the first time, and for these, I was in an atmosphere of China's brightest minds and best intellectuals at the time. So this is especially meaningful to them. So it was exhilarating to be there, because everything happened, day after day after day, something new. China now has Coca-Cola. Wow. China now has rock music. Wow. There's these new things opening. Not one novel could become a bestseller in 5 different translations. Marquez's book, 100 Years of Solitude, I think had 3 or 4 different Chinese translations, and people just ate it up. I mean, intellectuals would rave about this book, which is, So it was intellectually, culturally, spiritually, an amazing time. People could go overseas. They could interact with foreigners. They were very friendly to foreigners. The group themselves were extremely happy to be working with me, because they were also into the book, but I was a native English speaker, which is golden for them too. So with Yan Yong, he would speak to me in Chinese quite a bit. Sometimes Liu Haoming was focused on his English, right? So he wouldn't speak. I would try to speak Chinese with him, and he wouldn't do it, because he wanted to practice English and I wanted to practice my Chinese. So there was this kind of a tug of war going on there, which was fun actually, because we were both dedicated to language. So it was marvelous. It was a great time. It was an amazing time.
Tell me a bit more about working with the translators. Have they been abroad?
So the translators I was working with had never been abroad. So in fact, there was a lot they didn't know, because not only had they not been abroad, there was not this thing called the internet where you could kind of virtually go anywhere. They really had no clue about some things. In fact, I remember us taking a cab from the Friendship Hotel to the publisher's place in a car, and we got in the car, and one of the translators, Yan Yong, was in the car, and I remember him saying, they said, "Roll down your window if you want." And he looked at this thing and said, "What do you mean, roll down the window? What does that even mean, right? There's a window here." And then I said, "Here, you do this." And he said, "Oh, well, this is my first time in a car." He had never been in a car, and he was 21 years old. And that hit me also, that this is such a different world. And it came up in translations too, because we would have something like, a mother gives her child a Visa card so she can go to the mall. And they're saying, "Why do you need a visa to go to the mall?" And I said, "No, it's a credit card." And I said, "What's a credit card?" So there were these. It was fun, because there was a lot of this in the book. Americanisms, American things, extrasensory perception, or Jungian psychology. Concepts that were very Western, that they hadn't encountered yet and would have no reason to encounter. In fact, this was amazing to me too. I met not one of the translators, but another scholar at Peking University was telling me that he was a big fan of Kafka. I said, okay. And there were some translations, but he was reading it in English, or it should be German, but he was reading it in English, right? And then we talked a little about, and then I made a joke, something about Santa Claus. And he said, "What's Santa Claus?" And I thought, here's someone who was reading Kafka, and he doesn't know who Santa Claus is. And it occurred to me, if you don't even know what Christmas is all about, how can you even understand what the importance of Kafka? It's just these worlds were so separate, and it just blew my mind. So I really enjoyed not only being a cultural bridge to them was fun and interesting, but also I was learning a lot about where they were, what they knew, and how they've thought of the West. Lots of strange questions I would get from people. Like they say, "Is it true when children grow up and graduate and go out of the house that when they go back to their parents' home, the parents charge them rent?" I said, "Where did you hear that? That's not true." There were all kinds of myths like that were floating around that I had to dispel.
You were a foreigner at Beida when that was still very rare. What was it like those days?
Well, yes, it was very interesting to be a foreigner, and especially a foreign scholar there. And you're quite right. The number of foreign scholars was very, very limited. In a place like Beijing, very quickly, if you were in a certain field, you very quickly just met everyone in that field. So there was literally handfuls of people, and they were usually at Peking University and the Foreign Studies University, and it was one of those more prestigious places. And yeah, very, very few students. Probably one of the earliest ones was the company I used to work with called CET. I think they had one way back in the early 80s. Probably the first one, and we're bringing students here. The special thing about studying here, either as a student or as a scholar, a research scholar, was that China was not a place where you came for a vacation or to sort of just check it out and see the exotic sights and sounds, because it was a hard place to live in, but even not an easy place to be a tourist even in, right? So they didn't have the supply lines, they didn't have the English up to standards that would be useful enough. A lot of the services were new to them, seemed strange to them, and then it's the same thing with scholarship. It's like they didn't really know what to do with you if you're a scholar. Are you part of the faculty? Or are you just here visiting? I mean, people didn't know how to take care of this. Keep in mind, this was back when the Danwei system was still there and going away slowly, right? So when I don't know this, but I heard this in the 1970s. If you traveled in China, a Chinese person traveled, they wouldn't ask, "What's your name?" They'd say, "What's your Danwei?" And that would be because that would be the one who they'd charge the money to or whatever. But even then, when I was here, the Danwei system had not gone away, although lots of people were jumping into the ocean or jumping into the sea, as we say, Shanghai, starting up businesses.
Perhaps not everybody outside of China will know what a danwei is.
So back then, of course, we had this thing called the work unit, the Danwei. A unit, Danwei is just a unit. Everyone had to belong to a workforce, a Danwei unit, and that could be a factory that makes pots and pans or something like that. And they had to figure out how to fully employ these people, give them benefits, let their families have, they have to house them and so forth, right? So the Danwei is in charge of your life from beginning to end, your daily needs and so forth. But these Danweis, these work units, could be enormous, huge. The iron and steel factory here, has millions of workers. So, and some of the cases, these Danweis did not function under market conditions, what we would call capitalist situation, right? Profits and earnings were not the issue. It was basically keeping these people employed and getting them a lifestyle and getting the things that they needed, right? So the Danwei permeated your entire life, and also every Danwei had a file on you. And I was told I had a file. Even just coming there at Peking University, they were keeping track of me. So my Danwei was tracking me. Of course, I never had access to that file and could never get it, probably. But so that was what the Danwei was. So without explicitly mentioning it, it was always a factor in everyday life. You couldn't ignore it. If your Danwei didn't let you do this, or if you remember this Danwei, you had certain perks. If you were a member of that Danwei, you were looked down upon or something like that. Danweis had different statuses of being, some were elite and some were kind of disgusting, right? So that was the lifestyle in China. Also, I had to learn a little bit about these things. For example, I was helping to translate this book. I wanted things like paper clips or like file folders or something like that, a stapler. And I would go to the stores and I could not find these things. I said, and this would be in a stationery store, and I couldn't get a stapler or a Staples or a paper clip, right? And I was asked the two translators, my buddies, what's the deal? Where would I go get these things? And they went, oh, those things are not sold in stores like that. Your Dan Wei provides it for you. Tell me what you need. I just go get it. And I said, oh, okay. And he brought back a bunch of all this, pens, ink, paper, everything for me. And I realized, wow, the Dan Wei, it still provides. That's another reason you go and you see China, they're all wearing these blue outfits, or blue or green. It's the Dan Wei distributes these things. You don't have to buy the clothes. And that there was a lot I didn't know about China. And I really did not understand how this Dan Wei system worked. And the fact that I had a Dan Wei. And I went, what? Your Dan Wei is Peking University. And so that was kind of cool, actually. He said, 你的单位呢?北大. Whoa, 北大. I felt having power, even though I was not associated with, I was just working in this translation team, right? So as a scholar, it was exciting because, depending on what you were learning, there was a great chance to see and do some research on some aspect of China that was literally kind of virgin territory that no one had been able to explore before. No one had asked these questions before. And it was a great opportunity to start up new areas of research. So that was great, and that was promising, and that was exciting. But once you get in there and you start doing the research, you start bumping into these bureaucratic walls. Like, oh yeah, sure, you can go to this temple and study this thing. But then you get there and they say, no, who are you? Why are you here? Maybe you shouldn't be here. Maybe I have to come back tomorrow, I'll ask my boss here or something. And then you start getting these reluctance. People are a little afraid of foreigners. They're happy to talk with them and work with them, but they're also, this is too new. I don't want to let this foreigner in. I have no idea what he's going to do here, right? So it was frustrating because people couldn't, make the headway. And then there's also a very crucial aspect of that system back then. It's still somewhat today, but back then, to get anything done, you had to do what they called 走后门, to go through the back door. So, and I learned this because I would go try to do something, and they would say, no, it's impossible. And I would tell my friends, my buddies, they said, oh, you just have to know the right person. I know someone who might be able to help you. And sure enough, if you're the right person, what do you need? Oh, okay, and they go and tell them, and then they'd let me do it. So this whole thing of going through this back door, of this bureaucratic sort of maze you had to negotiate, and all these things, that was all vestiges of this Dan Wei system that everyone was kind of trapped in. Your Dan Wei provided you clothing, kids' education, food, haircuts, everything, and then they would cremate you when you died, and this from cradle to grave, right? And the people were used to this. People were used to this. So scholarship was intermingled in the world of Dan Wei system, and the Academy of Social Sciences is Dan Wei. So whenever I went there a few times, did some lectures or something, and I had to sign all sorts of things to get in and out, and it was a big deal. And, it may be the same way today for different reasons, but back then it was just the simple bureaucracy. People needed to know why you were here, and they needed to have some record of it. And if they had some reason to be afraid, the answer was just no. So, yeah, I was luckily not doing research. I was just doing this book, so I didn't run into those kinds of brick walls, but I know a lot of people who did.
At this point, we would like to take a moment to tell you about our project. The period between China's opening in 1979 under Deng Xiaoping and the 2010 Shanghai Expo deserves to be remembered. We want to collect the memories that Chinese, Americans, and other foreigners made together during these times. We hope you will subscribe to our channel to see many more interviews like this one in the coming weeks. If you too have a story that you think needs to be remembered, we would very much like to hear from you. And we would like to thank the U.S. Consulate in Shanghai for their generous support. Without their sponsorship, we would not have been able to start this channel. And now we return to our conversation with David Moser.
David, you came from a capitalist country when capitalism began to really change Chinese society. What was that like?
Yeah, that was really interesting. A lot of people did approach me, and they wanted to make me a partner in a business, or they thought I would somehow have business savvy just because I was an American. And I told them I'm what we call a nerd. I don't know anything at all about business. I just do my language stuff. But yes, a lot of people were Shanghai and dived into the sea. Means they left the Danwei and dived into the sea. The metaphor is, you're on your own now. This is unknown waters. You just have to live in. Yeah. So one of the things was massive experimenting, because they said, all right, Deng Xiaoping said, to get rich is glorious, right? And he said, black cat, white cat, as long as it catches mice, is a good cat. Meaning, go ahead and start up companies, get rich. We won't denounce you as being a capitalist roader or something like that. Don't worry about it. So there was that door opened, but people didn't know how to make money. What can I sell? What can I do that can make money? So a lot of things were kind of like low-hanging fruit. So if you could open a good restaurant that was fairly cheap, but had a variety, you would instantly be a success, because people were sick of eating the Danwei food, because there were all these Danwei cafeterias, and you can imagine how awful the food is. So if there's a restaurant there that actually serves something good, then I'm willing to pay a lot more for it, and maybe have more disposable income. So I'm going to eat at this restaurant. Hair cutting salons and beauty salons suddenly became the thing, because you couldn't do that with your Danwei. Suddenly, women could go and get these hairstyles, and men could get a good haircut, right? But those were two areas where you would succeed. If you can just do it, it will work. People will go, because it's going to be better than the Danwei system, no matter what. But other people, they didn't quite know what to do. So at Shoushuijie, which is now a building, was an area near the U.S. Embassy at that time, the U.S. Embassy. Where people who were trying to make a living and trying to figure out some way of making profits would just display their wares out there on the street, on just like blankets on the ground, and it was very interesting to see that, because these are people who had somehow gotten a hold of some products of some kind through a supply chain, or borrowing it, or someone, their uncle had one or something like that, or they went to Russia and brought some things back. And so you walk through these people selling things and say, okay, here's this guy, he's selling these things. What's he selling? Screwdrivers, bras, and Mao's little red book. Wow, what is this? What is this? What do you want? What's the price? And it's just, he had these three things, and he was going to see which things will sell and how much would it be. So it was all experimentation. So I'm saying, I mean, this really happened to me. I would say, Mao's Little Red Book. I don't have a copy of that. How much for Mao's Little Red Book? They say, 1,000 kwai. I say, what? No way. 10 kwai. They didn't know. Maybe I'd say, okay, right? And then they said, foreigners were willing to pay 1,000 kwai for a Chairman Mao book. But I said, 10 kwai, okay. I said, all right, somewhere between 10 and 1,000 is the price that a Lao Wai will buy, a foreigner will buy this thing. But this experimentation is going on all the time. Oh, you're selling bras. What women expect? How do you do it? What's the cost? And if it's faulty, do you discount? They were learning how to be business people. And that was exciting, because it was just up in there and nobody knew how to do it. It was a total experimentation. And then, as time went on, those just things on the ground became little shops, and then you had, companies that would form. So it was just all experimentation, and you had people traveling abroad, going to the Soviet Union. You begin to have Russians coming here, selling all kinds of things, and still to this day, parts of Beijing have these very Russian communities that still have Cyrillic alphabet everywhere. And they're almost doing the same thing. They're trying to sell things, and they're still, but back then it was just totally guesswork. And it was, I wrote a lot about that in this diary that I kept, it's so surreal to see these Western things, You remember this thing called Beanie Babies? There were these little baby dolls that they were very popular. Somehow someone came up with them, but just I look at them, they're bootleg. They don't look like the Beanie Baby. Someone would made what looked like Beanie Babies to them, but it wasn't. But they were just saying, let's try this. It seems to be big overseas. Let's just try this. I don't know if they succeeded or not, but that's the kind of thing you saw. So you saw tourists taking pictures of these things, like, what are these people thinking? They were thinking, how do I make money? And let's see if we can do that. So that was a great thing, a very interesting thing about that era. It was very dynamic, but also crazy, absolutely surrealistic almost.